What's new? Israel's devastating war with Hamas in Gaza has diverted attention from systemic and growing violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. Increasingly, the settlers are acting in concert with the army or wearing army uniforms themselves. They enjoyed the active support of far-right Israeli government ministers. Why does it matter? Settler violence, which has gone unchecked for years, is both a manifestation and a driver of Israel's settlement enterprise. Some 700,000 Israelis now live in West Bank settlements, including in East Jerusalem, rendering resolution of the conflict an ever more remote possibility. What should be done? Outside powers invested in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should sanction violent settlers, as some Western countries have started doing, and officials enabling violence. They should curb sales of weapons used in violation of international law, and raise the costs the Israeli government pays for settler violence and the settlement project. Executive Summary. Israeli settler violence, a phrase referring to ways in which Israelis living in the occupied West Bank terrorize, harm, and at times kill Palestinians and destroy their property, is at an all-time high. For decades, Israeli governments have failed to check and often tolerated such violence, but it has escalated significantly since late 2022, when Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government came to power, rising further after the Hamas-led 7 October attack on Israeli communities around Gaza. The government has boosted Israel's settlement project, while ministers close to hardliners in the settler movement openly cheer attacks on Palestinians. Sanctions the U.S. and European countries have imposed on some violent settlers are a start, but ignore that much of the responsibility lies with the Israeli state. Western countries should use their military aid to Israel and economic relations with it to impose greater costs on Israel for settlement expansion and settler violence that directly contradict their own stated policy and are making many parts of the West Bank increasingly unlivable for Palestinians. Since the 1967 war, during which it seized the West Bank, Israel has exercised military rule over the Palestinian population and expropriated more and more Palestinian land. Today, 230,000 Israelis live in occupied East Jerusalem and about 500,000 in the rest of the West Bank, both of which are internationally recognized as occupied territory. Israeli institutions, particularly the Supreme Court, and Israeli governments, notably that of Yitzhak Rabin in the mid-1990s, have sometimes made rulings or adopted policies curbing settlement activity. But the big picture is clear. Over decades, successive Israeli governments have enabled or encouraged an entrenched occupation in the West Bank that has seen ever more settlers move in. Leaders have usually cited security as the reason to build settlements, but in some cases, they have shared settlers' ideologically motivated drive to annex the area. Under Netanyahu's government, land seizures in the West Bank increased dramatically even before the Hamas-led 7 October attack. Violence by settlers against Palestinians, which for decades has accompanied settlement expansion, has also spiked in recent years. The aggressive acts, often perpetrated by gangs of armed young men, range from verbal intimidation and harassment to theft of livestock to assaults on Palestinians in which the settlers uproot farmers' olive trees and deny them access to land and water. In some cases, violence is motivated by revenge. When Israeli settlers are hurt in a Palestinian attack in the West Bank, for example, settlers retaliate. Settlers ran riot through the West Bank villages of Huwara and Termus Aya, destroying property, terrorizing residents, and clashing with Palestinians, despite neither village having any evident link to the shootings that supposedly triggered the attack. But if some violence is retribution, much of it aims to dispossess Palestinians, expand settlements, and extinguish any hope of Palestinian statehood. The 7 October attack and war in Gaza have made things even worse. aided by an army recruitment drive that provided settlers with weapons and uniforms to protect their own communities as reservists, and emboldened by a far-right government committed to expanding Israeli control of the West Bank, settlers have seized thousands of acres of West Bank land from Palestinians over the past year alone. Since 7 October, there have been over 1,000 incidents of settler violence, in which over 1,300 Palestinians have been driven from their homes. Rarely do Israeli courts convict settlers accused of violent acts. Israeli institutions have largely failed to rein in settlers. The traditional security establishment has increasingly criticized the violence, warning that it and the far-right's influence stoke instability in the West Bank and strain Israel's ties to Washington. Soldiers sometimes stand between settlers and Palestinians and may themselves face attacks by hardline settlers. Overall, though, the military's rank and file, like the police officers whose job it is to investigate settler crimes, see their primary obligation as protecting Jewish Israelis' interests and what they define as Israel's security, an imperative to which the courts invariably defer. Rarely do courts convict settlers accused of violent acts. Nor is settler violence the work of a few bad apples, as centrist politicians tend to paint it. As the army, like society, shifts rightward, instances of soldiers and settlers working in unison are more common. Plus, hardline settlers, once on the fringes of Israeli politics, today hold posts that give them power over West Bank affairs. They endorse settler violence by framing it as self-defense in a battle for land to which they say Israel is entitled. The uptick in settler violence has led Western governments to sanction individual settlers. In a 1 February executive order, the Biden administration put in place a framework for designating individuals and entities for sanctions. It has now listed 24 individuals and entities. European capitals and the EU have followed suit. In taking such steps, Western capitals have gone further than they have been ready to go previously, signaling to Israeli officials that they regard settler violence as a serious problem requiring urgent redress. Still, sanctioning individuals obscures the problem's core, reinforcing the narrative of a few lawbreakers acting outside the state's purview and taking the onus off the government. Western capitals, which mostly concur that settlements break international law, should go further. The U.S. could enforce domestic statutes already in effect. For example, by cutting assistance to Israeli military units that the U.S. knows have committed gross violations of human rights. European governments could better apply rules for trade with Israel involving goods made in West Bank settlements, or ban trade in those products altogether. Both the U.S. and Europe could consider sanctioning far-right cabinet members who applaud settler violence, a politically difficult move, but one that would signal where responsibility lies. Such steps will not necessarily force an about-face in Israel's policies, but they would raise costs for its failure to curb settler violence, and they might dent in the impunity that has helped empower Israel's far-right over decades. Since October 2023, the West Bank has taken a back seat to the war and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, exchanges of fire on the Israel-Lebanon border, and fears of a wider Middle East war. Yet the settlement expansion and surging settler violence in the West Bank upping the likelihood of a larger outbreak of violence there. Western powers appear reluctant to take stronger action. In the U.S. in particular, any change in policy may have to wait until after the November elections, and what is feasible then will almost certainly hinge on the results. For their part, European capitals are split on how to respond. Yet Western leaders' repeated calls for a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on two states have long rung hollow absent firmer measures to check the settlements that are killing off hope of Palestinian statehood. Source: Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, Washington, Brussels, 6 September 2024. Introduction. Some 500,000 Jewish Israeli citizens live in the occupied West Bank in over 300 settlements and outposts established since the June 1967 war. Another 200,000 or so live in East Jerusalem, which Israel annexed after the war. Most settlers live in urban or suburban settlements from which they can commute to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, as the majority of settlers work inside Israel. Nearly half of them live in 4 large settlement blocks in different parts of the West Bank. More isolated but established settlements, as well as newer, more ideologically driven hilltop settlements and settlement outposts, are sprinkled throughout the West Bank countryside. International courts have repeatedly held that the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is occupied territory under international law, a status that is inherently temporary, and that the Fourth Geneva Convention governs Israel's actions there. In July, the International Court of Justice found, as it had in 2004, that Israel's settlement policy is in breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention's Article 49, which provides that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Its advisory decision also stated that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful, and that Israel is under an obligation to cease immediately all new settlement activities and to evacuate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel rejects characterizations of the settlements as illegal because it rejects the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention in the territories it occupied in 1967. Among other theories it has advanced, it has argued that there was no previous legitimate sovereign in the case of the West Bank. Bank and East Jerusalem, which were both under Jordanian rule from 1948 to 1967, and Gaza, which was run by Egypt. Thus, there is no one to whom to return these territories following negotiations. Israel treats the occupied territories as administered. In Israeli discourse, the West Bank is generally known by biblical names, Judea for the part south of Jerusalem and Samaria to Jerusalem's north. The settlements, whose expansion has accelerated over the last few years, make the prospect that a viable Palestinian state could emerge in these territories increasingly distant, if not impossible to imagine. Western states, including Israel's closest ally, the U.S., have pressed Israel to halt its settlement drive, both because of legal concerns and because the settlements would impede a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but to no avail. Indeed, weathering outside pressure has emboldened successive Israeli governments to enlarge the settlement project as Israeli politics drift steady rightward. Over the past few years, since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's current government, which includes far-right parties, assumed power, and especially since the Hamas-led attacks on 7 October 2023, the tempo of both settlement activity and acts of settler violence against Palestinians has increased dramatically. This report takes a close look at the roots and drivers of settler violence, the reasons for its recent acceleration, its ties to Israeli government aims, and the impediments it creates to efforts at achieving a just, sustainable peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It also offers recommendations for how Israel's Western partners can better impose costs on the Israeli government for supporting and enabling this behavior. It draws on dozens of interviews with Israeli, Palestinian, and U.S. officials, local representatives and leaders, academics, legal and human rights experts, as well as Israeli settlers and Palestinian West Bank residents. The majority of the interviewees were men, reflecting a gendered power divide in this conflict, both at the government level and on the ground. Conclusion. Events of the past months, the 7 October attack on Israel, Israel's devastating war on Gaza, and escalating army and settler violence in the West Bank underline that unresolved, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only lead to greater bloodshed, suffering, and regional instability. Finding a path toward a sustainable solution is as urgent as ever. Any such effort should, at the outset, be two-pronged. Crisis Group has argued separately for the pressing need for Palestinian political renewal, including a rejuvenated leadership that commands greater public support. The second imperative is greater effort to hold Israel accountable for its actions as an occupying power, especially its settlement enterprise and the ensuing violence by settlers, who increasingly enjoy protection, if not outright sponsorship, from state institutions. Even as the U.S. and other external actors push for a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of Israeli hostages, they need to do more than broker a deal between Israel and Hamas. Israel's settlement enterprise and the corresponding dispossession of the Palestinians is slowly killing off any hope of a durable resolution of the conflict. Settler violence is the cutting edge of that enterprise. The impunity with which settlers act and the fact that hardline Israeli leaders and government itself pay no price for failing to rein in and increasingly supporting their aggression not only risks leaving the conflict on a downward spiral, but has, over time, empowered the most lawless elements of Israeli society. For too long, countries avowedly dedicated to a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have allowed this situation to fester. Their policies will not change overnight, but even a strong signal to Israel that its approach is not only pernicious for the Palestinians, but also an act of self-harm, could generate adjustments that, cumulatively, might point the way to a better future.